so glad and so honored to be joining our guest today. This episode is on the economic crisis in this country right now and the need to get money into the hands of people so that they can cover their basic needs. But we want to take a moment to recognize that today, the economic crisis is met with another crisis of policing in America. Last week in Minneapolis, a police officer pinned George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, to the ground and pressed his knee into Floyd's neck for 8 minutes. Floyd could be heard saying, "Please, please, please, I can't breathe." And reports said he called out for his mother, but the officer wouldn't remove his knee from Floyd's neck. George Floyd died. 2 months earlier, in Louisville, Kentucky, police officers broke down the door of Breonna Taylor's home at nearly 1 a.m. to execute a no-knock warrant for a person who had been arrested earlier that day and who did not live at that address. Kenneth Walker, who was there with Miss Taylor, believed the home was being burgled. He fired a warning shot. Officers responded with gunfire. They shot Miss Taylor 8 times, killing her. Breonna Taylor died. These 2 killings do not mark the presence of a few bad apples in an otherwise healthy profession, but rather they are only the latest visible symptoms of a crisis in policing in America, and frankly, a crisis in our democracy. We have Senator Kamala Harris with us today, and she's not only the sponsor of legislation to give people monthly $2,000 payments, but also a former prosecutor in San Francisco and former Attorney General of California. And I'm going to ask her about both the policing crisis and the economic crisis. And you're hearing it everywhere. America is in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. More than 100,000 people have died. Millions more have been infected. And as we discussed last week with Senator Jeff Merkley and Representative Mark Pocan, testing is nowhere near it needs to be to safely reopen the country. We are at about 250,000 daily tests, while experts say we need about 1 million tests done every single day. Contact tracing is just beginning, but the federal legislation needed to do it right is on hold. So even if workplaces can rehire employees, those employees are likely going to risky workplaces. In the meantime, Congress has failed to provide enough paycheck protection, and tens of millions of families with unemployment issues face problems paying for food, for gas, water, bills, rent, and they need help now. Research shows that the first round of direct payments, the $1,200 stimulus check, was mostly spent on food, gas, and housing. We are joined today by Senator Kamala Harris, who co-sponsored legislation alongside Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Ed Markey that would provide $2,000 a month per person. The monthly Economic Crisis Support Act would also act retroactively to March to help relieve mounting financial burdens on the millions of Americans earning less than $120,000 every year. So thank you so much for joining us, Senator Harris. I think you're on mute. Hold on 1 second.
Okay, it's so great to be with you, and thank you for your leadership and for everyone. I'm honored to be with so many friends, colleagues, and American leaders. So, let's just start with this moment. I do believe it's obvious that today, in these last few days, America is raw right now. America is raw, and her wounds are exposed. And we need to deal with that, and we need to confront it. And part of the issue here is that we have never fully acknowledged or addressed the fact that Black Americans have been treated as less than human through the course of the history of our country. And we have never fully addressed the systemic racism and the causes of what we now have been talking about even before these last few days in terms of the disparities, be it on public health issues, economic issues, or educational issues. And so, when I think about this moment, I, of course, as we all do, think about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and also about what we need to do to speak the truth about the innocent men and women, unarmed men and women, predominantly Black men and women, who have died at the hands of abusive police officers and criminal police officers. And so I also think of this as a moment where it's highlighting something which we've known. Probably one of the greatest, most recent advancements among those in the fight for civil rights has been the creation of the smartphone. And for the first time, some people are seeing what communities of people have known for generations. And so it's time to just once and for all, 30 years after Rodney King, address all this and deal with it and understand that there are very specific things that we can do. These are not new ideas, but they lack implementation. And we need a national movement and a demand that we implement these reforms and do it immediately.
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator Harris. So, one of the things that I think you're touching on that we've been talking about here at the Appeal and also just the national conversation is that what is happening is not just one episode of police brutality, right? I mean, it's an episode of the media and white Americans paying attention to the everyday reality of what it means to be Black in America, be Black in certain neighborhoods, and be under the thumb of a brutal police system. So what do you think, and what do you want to see happen at the federal level? Obviously, a lot of this is a local issue, and we like to reiterate that because we want to make sure that people also pay attention to what exists on the local level. But what do you think we can do at the federal level, given that you're a senator who also has a long history working in the criminal justice system?
So there are a number of things, and you're right that the federal system is but one of a very big criminal justice system in America, a system of incarceration, a system that needs reform. I do believe that when we can implement those at a federal level, it also creates a new standard for what the states must do. And it gives those who are the advocates and the leaders in the movement for reform a reference point of what has actually been done and can be done. So there are a number of things. One, we need a national standard around use of force. So there are prosecutors around the country, and you know the names, who have attempted to bring these cases where there's been excessive use of force by police to court. They've charged the cases, but the standard is practically insurmountable, because the standard is this. When asking the question about whether there was an excessive use of force, the question is, was the use of force in that case reasonable? Well, we all know that, and if any of us have children or have parented children, we know that you can always find a reason for something. That does not mean it is right. And so what I'm arguing for, and what many of us are arguing for, is that we need to change the standard to ask not was it reasonable, but was it necessary? Was it necessary for that police officer to have his knee on the neck of George Floyd for not only those very minutes when he was struggling, but those 2 minutes and 38 seconds when he was clearly unconscious before he died? That's one thing. Change the standard for use of force. Another, independent investigations. I am a former prosecutor. I know what I'm speaking of when I say DA's offices, states' attorneys' offices should not be in the business of doing the investigation, much less the responsibility of charging and prosecuting a police officer with whom that office works every day. No matter how well-intentioned that prosecutor may be, it will not inspire confidence by the public, and justice cannot be done. So I'm arguing for independent investigations across the country. Bring in the attorney general of that state if they have criminal capacity, bring in another prosecutor's office, but bring in the United States Department of Justice, independent investigations. The other thing we need to do is we need to collect the data and have transparency. When I was Attorney General of California, we created what we called Open Justice. I ran the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, second only to the United States Department of Justice, in a state of 40 million people. They had never shared through an open data system criminal justice data, and nobody wanted it to happen, but we made it happen. We fought against the obstacles, and I exposed California criminal data around deaths in custody, around things like arrest rates and race based on race and geographic area, so that the activists, the advocates don't have to scratch to get that information through public records requests, and can have the information so that instead of asking for change on bended knee asking for these systems to do the right thing, we will have the evidence and the data that supports clearly the need for reform. So these are some of the things. We also need to have a national registry for misconduct, because where there are, we've seen these situations where police officers were let go for misconduct and were allowed to resign, for example, and then go to another jurisdiction, and there's no record of their previous misconduct, and we need to have a national registry. And the bottom line, Josie, that I feel very strongly about is this: bad cops need to go to jail, and bad cops are bad for good cops. So let's recognize there are two systems of justice in America. One, if you are a Michael Flynn, another, if you are George Floyd. And that is why the people are marching. So let's fight for the ideals that say equal justice under law. And there are very, very concrete initiatives that will make all the difference. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
What about now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Someone keeps muting me on the host side, so I should be unmuted now. I want to move into our conversation about economics and income equality, and I want to acknowledge that, like, what we're seeing happening nationwide right now is also a reflection of people feeling an enormous amount of stress and anger around a government that they don't feel like is taking care of them, and so that goes beyond policing. Obviously, policing is a huge part of it, but it's not just that. So let's talk about basic needs and basic dignity. So meeting people's basic needs is the goal of a guaranteed income. Right. And you've come close to endorsing a guaranteed income bill in the past. In 2018, not long after your election, you proposed major tax credits to middle and working class families. But this bill goes further, right? I mean, it's directly providing cash to people.
Yeah, that's right.
So how has the economic crisis presented by COVID impacted your sense of urgency for guaranteed income?
So, Andrew and I were on that debate stage together for a whole year last year. And before the pandemic, before these days of crisis unparalleled, Andrew would talk about the fact that almost half of American families couldn't afford a $400 unexpected expense, right? That in 99% of the counties in the United States, if you're a minimum wage worker working full-time, you can't afford market rate for a one-bedroom apartment. Essential needs, as you have said, right? Just basic needs for living. And because the fact is, the cost of living in America has continually gone up, but wages have remained stagnant. People cannot afford to live and deal with essential functions of raising a family. I would often talk about the fact $400, you know what that is? Well, if you've ever bought 4 tires, right? Because you're traveling on roads that have potholes every day, and you got to travel 2 hours to go where you work because you can't afford to live where you work. Right. These things add up. So what I'm proposing, along with Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts and Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, is that during the course of the COVID crisis, where now we have over 40 million people who lost their jobs within the last 100 days, that they will receive $2,000 per individual, $4,000 as a couple, $2,000 per child a month through the term of the pandemic, plus 3 months thereafter. And the point behind it, that maybe some would think of as even a moral point, is just about humanitarian concerns and priorities. 40 million people plus lost their jobs within the last 100 days. Most did not have savings. See that statistic about can't afford a $400 unexpected expense. And this is through no fault of their own. And what we want, what is just the right thing to do, is that, one, the government should be here for the people in a moment of crisis. People should be able to count on their government to see them and create a safety net for them, so that these families don't fall into poverty or further into poverty during the course of this pandemic, so that they can get back on their feet when it is over. And that's what this is about. And we all benefit from that, not only as a society that is a society that is one for all, but a society that relies on each other's well-being for our own well-being. So this is essentially what it's about. And you would be surprised how much bipartisan support, at least among the people, maybe not among the legislators, but among the people,
Right.
there is for this.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, Congress has not followed up yet, but again, it's another reflection of how Congress, I think, especially on the right, often doesn't reflect the priorities of the constituents, right? Because we know research from the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress shows that voters strongly support additional direct payments lasting throughout the pandemic. 2/3 of voters, including most Republicans, want emergency once a month $2,000 payments for every person in America.
That's right.
We understand, I think, both on an individual and a societal level, that this is the way to get out of this pandemic, you know, as in as good shape as we can, rather than letting the economy crater and people's lives crater, playing at some sort of imaginary politics. And, you know, I guess we'd love to hear from you why you think these direct payments are, you know, why do you think we need repeated payments? Why is one payment not enough? Why is two payments not enough? Why do we need to make sure that people have this for kind of the duration of however long this pandemic lasts?
Well, can you imagine someone saying, you need to only pay rent once, ever? Right. You only need to buy groceries 1 week.
Right.
You only for months, right? But you need to buy groceries for 1 week. The reality of life is that people have recurring expenses. And the fact that we, during this crisis, only gave direct payments of one time and $1,200 during what has now been months of people being required to stay at home for the sake of public health, right? While many did not have paid sick leave, some are losing their jobs. Almost half, if not over half of America's workforce either runs a small business or works for a small business, right? So you look at the connection there in terms of all the small businesses that are falling apart, and that also highlights the defects of the Paycheck Protection Program. So this is about saying, let us just see people based on how we all live. And the reality is that individuals, families have monthly bills, and it's about rent, it's about food, it's about basic necessities. And to see people through this crisis, we have to see them where they live and help them through the prism of how people actually live life. If we want to recover, you know, this whole conversation about, you know, let's open back up. Well, let's apply that spirit, right? Which is let's get back up, right? That's really the thing too, is let's get back up. Well, how are families going to get back up if they are so mired in debt? In fact, one of the things I'm also calling for is that credit card interest payments should be suspended during this period of time, because people who have credit cards are buying basic necessities with those credit cards, such as groceries. I'm also saying that during this period of time, we should suspend negative reporting to credit agencies, because once somebody's credit score is dinged, it can take a lifetime for them to recover and then have access to capital. So during the course of this pandemic, with 40+ million people who just lost their jobs, suspend reporting, negative reporting to credit score companies. And again, because the idea is that when we do open back up for real, let's give people every opportunity to jump back on their feet. Because right now, this pandemic has knocked a lot of people down.
And we know what today is, right? It's June 1st. This is the day.
Rent is due today.
Yeah, rent is due today. Right. And this is the third month. I mean, for some people, the fourth month, right? That they are recognizing that they're, you know, still have no kind of certainty in their economic future, and still facing eviction when this is over, or really struggling in a very active, very present sense. And so I'm gonna, we have a video here from a change.org petitioner and a Denver restaurant owner. Her name's Stephanie Bonin, and we'd love to hear your response to what she says. So we're gonna play that now.
Okay.
In Colorado. As businesses like mine get the green light to slowly reopen, we are not clear on our path to success. since we are reopening with both hands tied behind our back. We are juggling so much uncertainty, there is no room for error as we attempt to keep guests and employees safe and win back their confidence and also manage our finances so we can survive. In March, when it became clear that the economic consequences of COVID-19 were just beginning, I started a petition on change.org to ask Congress to pass $2,000 payments monthly for as long as this crisis continues. I was overwhelmed, but not surprised by the response. I knew families like mine needed more help from the government. As of today, 1.2 million Americans from all 50 states have signed this petition. I speak for all the signers when I say thank you. We are so grateful to you, Senators Harris, Sanders, and Markey, for introducing the monthly Economic Crisis Support Act. People need to be able to plan for how they will buy groceries, pay their utility bills, and start to spend money at small businesses like mine. We need your legislation calling for $2,000 a month to pass. The well-being of our families, businesses, and country depends on it. Along with the leaders from change.org and Economic Security Project, I urge you to share these petition signatures with your 99 colleagues and make sure that they know America needs more emergency money for the people. Thank you for your leadership.
So I want to thank Stephanie for that video, and I wanted to hear Senator Harris what you thought. And I just, 1.2 million people. That's an enormous amount of people. That's on top of substantial national research showing people want direct cash payments, need them, and would use them on things like food and shelter. And we talk about the individual because it's true. Individuals and families really need this, really need these payments. But what does this mean for the economy? I think what we're hearing from the other side is a narrative of we can't afford this. And to me, it seems like we can't afford not to do this, right? And so what do we think that these payments will do for the economy as a whole?
Well, let me start by saying, Stephanie, wow, that's incredible. And I will share your petition and all those names with my colleagues. We have a system where we send out what's called a Dear Colleague letter, and I'll get it to all of them. So thank you, because that takes a lot of work, but it's important for everyone to understand these are names and faces and people behind this issue. So, one of the things, first of all, that just I find tiring is those who want to suggest, oh, this is a lot of money, when they're the same people who passed a tax bill benefiting the top 1% and the biggest corporations of America and are going to cause us to face a $1 trillion deficit as a result of it. So let's put it in that context. But let's also understand, as Stephanie said, that getting this money in the pockets of the people is about allowing them to pay their rent. So their rent may be paid to a grandmother who owns a duplex, and that duplex is everything that she has in terms of a pension to retire on. That is about them being able to go to the local business, which, by the way, 90% of small businesses that were minority or women owned did not get the benefit of the PPP, the barbershop, the bodega, the beauty supply, or the beauty salon. So it's about that money going back into the stream of the economy. And it's about the productivity and what we will do to allow these families to be productive. On the small business small business piece, I also want to say this. Again, 90% of small businesses that were women and are women or minority owned did not get the benefit of the PPP. Ayanna Pressley, who's the congresswoman from Massachusetts, and she has it on the House side, and she's carrying legislation that we created. It's called basically Save Our Street, and it's about saving the business down the street. And specifically what we are proposing is for businesses that have 10 or fewer employees, of which there are many, that they will put aside a pot of $125 billion for them specifically. So they don't have to compete with all of these privately run and publicly traded companies, which is what happened last time, or the hedge fund connected companies. Instead, they will have a specific pot of money, $125 billion, so they can apply for loans and grants of up to $250,000 to get back on their feet. And that's part of, again, what we're going to do to help regenerate the economy. Because when these small businesses and when these families that we're talking about and those 1.2 million folks, when we help them, we lift up the economy of the nation as a whole. And it's really actually that simple. And so if you want to talk about cost, you can't do that without talking about benefit. And the benefit of this outweighs the cost every way you cut it.
Mm-hmm. So we want to ask you just, I'm not going to keep you all day, although that would be great. We're going to ask you just a couple more questions, but I wanted to show you one more video. This is another video of working families and talking about what they're going through right now.
Yeah.
I'm one of the million Americans who signed the petition for change.org for Americans to get $2,000 a month from the government.
I am an unemployed school bus driver. A one-time payment of $1,200. I mean, it'll help us for a month, but it's not going to keep us going until school starts again. And I just pray that the government can help us out a little bit more.
I've been a small business owner for 16 years and my doors are now closed. I continue to pay commercial real estate because my landlords are unwilling to negotiate. I'm not able to receive any of the SBA loans that were all but promised to me because they're running out of funds. This is how I feed my family.
I lost my job at the mall, my second job, due to the coronavirus. I don't have any income. My brother injured his back. He doesn't have any income. My dad has a construction job and all of the projects are done. We need help from the government.
I cannot pay my bills because I'm not working and nobody's hiring because of this whole situation, this epidemic.
Don't know how I'll be able to put food on the table, buy toilet paper, buy toiletries. It's hard. It's so scary. I don't know how I'll fill up my gas. We need your help and we need it now.
We are struggling and terrified about what we're going to do for our 4-month-old daughter and for ourselves because we can't afford to buy formula, pay for our bills, diapers, necessary things that we need on a daily, and we're terrified. We need help right away.
I've been waiting 4 weeks just to hear anything back from unemployment and have not received a stimulus check. Only error messages from the government website.
What would $2,000 a month for the government do for me? It would help me be able to stay afloat with my family.
But I've signed this change.org petition asking for $2,000 a month from my government. Boy, would that help me and keep us alive. Thank you for listening. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, that's deeply, deeply moving. And I think brings home what we know, which is that people are in a moment of crisis. And you've been talking about the national efforts to move the ball on these issues. So just to ask explicitly, what's the holdup? You know, Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans are not the only complication here. And we obviously have a lot of movement from people like you, Senator Markey, Senator Sanders. I really want to get this thing moving. You know, Speaker Pelosi has had a little trouble keeping members of the House on the same page, and you've expressed some support for the HEROES Act, but as you know, obviously it doesn't include recurring payments as well as the need to go further. So for people who support your efforts for larger recurring payments, what would you tell them about where the divides are right now in Congress, I think especially on the Democratic side, and how that is affecting the pandemic response and what you think they can do?
Well, do what you're doing right now. I mean, this is where there is the power of the people. The 1.2 million people signing a petition, using their voices to tell the truth, not just the stories, right? This is not storytelling, this is not fiction. This is about truth telling the truth about what is happening in America today. And the fact that, like the people that we just saw in the video, they need to be seen, they must be heard. And we must see them as they are describing through the full lens and the prism of their lives. It's about buying diapers. It's about this small business owner and how are they going to pay the bills by the end of the month? It's about the young woman who was working at the mall and also clearly is helping to support her family, including a brother who can't work. These are the real stories, and we have to keep doing that so that in Washington, D.C., it doesn't just become theoretical, but it becomes real. And it becomes about also showing that this is affecting everyone in our country. That pandemic could care less who you voted for in the last presidential race. The 40 million plus people who lost their jobs, they represent everybody of who we are, and they need their government to work for them. So we just have to keep fighting. And we have to remember that part of the spirit of all of our successful movements have been about understanding the importance of coalition, showing that despite what seems to be differences among us, we all have so much more in common than what separates us. So working on that coalition, it is about a principle, which is a very basic principle in my mind, which is that no one should be made to fight alone, especially when we're talking about injustice. And in this moment, we're talking about a variety of them, including economic injustice. So these are the things that we have to do. We must be heard. And the only way to do that is to keep speaking and shouting as necessary.
Thank you so much, Senator Harris, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Josie. It's good to be with you.
So we're going to move on to our second panel, which is going to talk about COVID-19 and what it's exposed about the underlying fragility of our economy. So we're going to talk more about direct cash payments and what recovering from this economic crisis and building lasting economic security in America actually means. You've heard a lot about what's happening at the national stage, and we'd like to turn now to some of the local efforts and success stories of those advocates and officials working to provide economic relief to working families. And we're delighted to be joined by our second panel, and including incredible guests, including Andrew Yang, the founder of Humanity Forward and another recent candidate for president who focused on basic income as a very core part of his platform. Thank you, Andrew Yang, for joining us. We also have Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, California, who is overseeing the first guaranteed income program in the country in Stockton. We'll hear more about that soon. And we're about to bring in some of the key experts and academics behind this discussion. So Natalie Foster is the co-founder of the Economic Security Project. She is working to prevent corporate economic power consolidation and protect working families' economic security. Professor Derek Hamilton of Ohio State, yay, go Ohio State. Ohio State's Kirwan Institute is studying the causes of racial and other inequalities in economic and health outcomes and searching for innovative policies to increase equality in those areas. And Felicia Wong is president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, which is a think tank that seeks to reimagine the rules that shape our economy and society so that they work for all Americans. So let's start with you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Josie. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Your mic is doing great. You famously ran on basic income as an issue, and your Yang Gang and early momentum sort of changed the conversation of this election and made it really a mainstream issue before we even knew that this pandemic was looming. You've talked about the dangers of automation, and the pandemic has really shown that working families are economically vulnerable to much more than just machines, right? How has your basic income movement continued and evolved since the campaign and since the pandemic?
Well, since the campaign, we've given about $3 million in direct economic relief to struggling families around the country. And another $3 million or so is being distributed right now at movehumanityforward.com. So if you know someone who needs help, if you send them to movehumanityforward.com, unfortunately, we have a waiting list of tens of thousands of Americans, as you'd imagine, but we're hoping that we can help. And that's what we need right now. I'm thrilled you had Kamala on because you have to look at it. You have to look at the opportunity we have right now. Our problems have accelerated where we've experienced 10 years worth of displacement in 10 weeks. But we have a real chance here to alleviate poverty. Right now, there are multiple bills that would put $2,000 a month into the hands of every American for the duration of the pandemic, which we all know may extend for months, even years. And I will suggest to everyone that if you actually pass that, it's not like you can take it away from tens of millions of Americans like 18 months from now, because our economy is going to be a shambles ongoing. I mean, we're facing a new Great Depression, but there are legislators that have bills on the table that if enough Americans get behind, we can pass this today. Like what I fought for on the campaign trail is not hypothetical. We have tens of millions of Americans whose lives are disintegrating before our eyes. And we have to tell our government to get its shit together and get money out to the people. This is not an academic discussion. This is a life or death discussion. And we all know that the systemic poverty is fueling the riots that that are the outgrowth of generations of neglect. The fact that George Floyd is dead because he used what's allegedly a counterfeit $20 bill. I mean, you have material deprivation that is driven the oppression of millions of Americans, and it's led to tragic outcomes. So we have a chance right now, and we have to take that chance. Like, I applaud everyone who's been working on UBI for years, because, you know, we helped prepare society for this moment, but this is the moment. There is no tomorrow at this point. If we don't get this done, we're going to see our way of life disintegrate before our eyes.
Absolutely. So what do you say to people in terms of what they need to do? I mean, Senator Harris talked about telling stories and making sure that they're talking to their elected representatives. You know, I think it's remarkable that your organization and you all are doing so much work to get money in the hands of people, but obviously in the world we want to live in, that's the government's job, not people on the ground, right? And so how do we make sure that people know what to do, and how to make, you know, how to really meet this moment and get it passed?
We need a political revolution in this country where anyone who is not for cash relief loses their position, and until our government is dominated by people who see that putting money into our hands is the right thing to do. That's it. Like, if your local candidates are, you know, you might like them on every other level, but they're against this, they need to go. And if someone's supporting it, we need to put political pressure on everyone who's running for any national office or local office, even, that if they're not for cash relief, they're going to lose. That is the only way we have a chance to win. The vast majority of Americans know this is the right thing to do. The problem is that the feedback mechanism between people and our legislators has broken down. Like, our legislators have been overrun by corporate money. DC is the richest city in the country. Their lives are completely disconnected with ours. And so that's what we have to change. Like, that's a political revolution is necessary. I was optimistic that my campaign could help accelerate that. But we don't have any time anymore. So figure out who represents you in office, figure out if they're for a cash relief bill. If they are not, write them and say, you need to get for this, or I will vote against you and volunteer against you in the next election. And then the next time anyone raise their hand, I'm supporting, you know, maybe a dozen candidates around the country who are for cash relief. And it's putting pressure on people in their district to get on board. So I need help. We need help. You need help. The American people need help. The fact that 1.2 million people signed that change.org petition, that's like a drop in the bucket. I mean, like, we can all see tens of millions of lives, like tens of millions of jobs have been lost. And that's an underestimate, because the reality is a lot of people who had these part-time informal jobs, like, they can't file for unemployment. So if you look at it, you're talking about at least 25 to 30% of the US population will not have any meaningful income. And every day counts. Like, you can hang on for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but by the time you get to month 2 or 3, terrible things start to happen in that household, in that family, in that community.
Absolutely. So Natalie, I want to move to you quickly. So can you talk, it's so interesting. You always hear people talk about how America has the strongest economy in the world. We're the richest country in the world. This is a narrative that's perpetuated sort of throughout all of our discourse, right? And then something like this happens, and it really makes you think about the underlying fragility of our economy. So can you talk about what the underlying fragility of our economy looks like right now, and why would a guaranteed income, what does it mean for America's like long-term economic security or broad economic security?
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought Senator Harris laid it out so well, and Andrew did too. I mean, before the COVID crisis was a human-made crisis of an economy that was so broken that most families couldn't pull together $400 in an emergency if needed. And now we're staring down 40 million unemployed people, and it's hitting communities of color hardest. The National Women's Law Center had a recent report that said Black and Latinx women had the highest level of job loss in April. And these are women that pre-COVID were making just cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. And this is a fact well known to Aisha Nyandaro, who's a visionary running the Magnolia Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi. She's giving $1,000 a month to single Black mothers as a demonstration of the power of a guaranteed income. And she knows that her participants' abilities to earn an income is hampered by racism and sexism. And so a guaranteed income would provide a floor through which no person can fall. It would ensure that our communities can handle public health crises, that mothers can put food on the table for their children, and it would challenge our very notion of deservedness, which is what we're hearing echoed right now in the streets. Mm-hmm. So this crisis, I think, is opening up big political space for solutions like a guaranteed income. And we've seen really strong leadership in the Democratic Party. We've seen several bills introduced that would create an income floor until the crisis is over. As we've heard, Senator Harris is leading the charge with Senators Sanders and Markey. But in the House, you have Detroit Congressman Rashida Tlaib, who has a bill guaranteeing $2,000 a month, as do Congressman Ro Khanna from California and Tim Ryan from Ohio. And Pennsylvania Congresswoman Madeline Dean has been a real champion for regular checks until the economy recovers. And they're popular, right? We know that 88% of people want monthly checks. So despite the leadership and despite the popularity, the idea of monthly checks, which is known in policy circles as automatic stabilizers. Josie, before you were laughing about all the acronyms that people have. But automatic stabilizers in policy circles are actually really important. They mean that the checks come until we hit a certain criteria. And that idea was not included in the HEROES Act. Monthly checks weren't included in the HEROES Act, which is the bill that most recently passed the House. And we really hope Speaker Pelosi and other Democratic leaders will embrace the power of regular cash payments and put automatic stabilizers into any final legislation. Because, across the country, we're seeing the pain of communities that have been attacked, marginalized, and left out. We're seeing the desperation of people who deserve a system that works for them, that values Blacks' lives and everyone's labor. And we have so much reckoning to do as a nation. So let's provide an income to stabilize families and get to work on the work we have to do.
And I just want to note, to your point, to Andrew Yang's point, to Senator Harris' point, this is not theoretical, right? And we know that, and Mayor Tubbs, you especially know that. So you're not only the youngest mayor in American history of a city with a population over 100,000. That's the kind of statistic I love, by the way. That's a good one. And the only mayor of a city piloting, you're also the only mayor of a city piloting a guaranteed income model. And I remember reading about this, time is a construct at this point, but a while ago, and it seeming just so big and futuristic. And now we're here, right? We're in the moment where I think, like Andrew said, it's do or die. So can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to kind of try this demonstration project in Stockton? And do you think that being a younger mayor, being of a different generation, that you are seeing younger generations more excited about this and more ready for this than their counterparts?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting such an important conversation. And to all the literally some of the smartest people in the world and thinking about the economy of today and the future, I'm excited to continue to learn from you all and help amplify your work and your work you do as well in the nonprofit journalism space and the law space. Very, very grateful. But to answer your question, I first heard about a guaranteed income or an income floor 13, 14 years ago. Or more like 10 years ago as a freshman in college. I was studying Dr. King in the class, and we read Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And I remember being really interested because in this book written in 1967, 1968, at a time of racial strife and unrest and people protesting in the streets and cities burning, Dr. King talked about sort of his vision for economic justice and for dismantling systems of white supremacy included a guaranteed income. I remember being very shocked because growing up in church and quoting Dr. King's speeches, I had never heard anyone mention kind of a basic income or a guaranteed income as part of his legacy. And then I read that and I said, it'd be really cool one day to be part of that policy conversation. Like, was this really what we need in this country? And then my first year as mayor and looking at the issues, realized a lot of the issues we face in Stockton were issues of poverty. And a lot of the issues that we face in Stockton were ideas people had about how the economy works and what's actually happening on the ground. Meaning that a lot of people believe that people were struggling because they were lazy, or people were struggling because they weren't as smart, or people were struggling because they weren't working. And we found that the vast majority of our residents who can work do work. But as Senator Harris said, work wasn't paying. And my staff came back to me with this idea of a basic income. And I said, well, you guys, we just got elected. I'm young, first African-American mayor. I don't want to be the last. So let's hold off on this idea. And then literally a week later, I actually met Natalie Foster at a conference. And she spoke about how the Economic Security Project, which has been doing amazing work on this issue, was looking for a city to partner with and pilot with. And I told her we had a task force discussing and looking at this issue. And we decided in October 2017, we announced that we would be piloting a basic income. But the idea wasn't to be bold for bold's sake. And the idea wasn't necessarily one I viewed as incredibly futuristic. It was really kind of looking at the fact that today, 1 in 2 people, as Andrew and the senator said, can't afford one $500 emergency. And that today people were working incredibly hard and couldn't pay for basic necessities. And that this idea has been talked about literally since Thomas Paine and the Agrarian Revolution at the beginning of the conversation we're having about America. And I just felt that what was risky or what was bold was a status quo that was failing then. Its failures are even more kind of in focus now, and that it was important and incumbent on leadership to do something to force the conversation around sort of what society do we want to live in.
So can you tell us quickly what is next for your efforts in Stockton? What comes next, and how do you think a project like the one that you have in Stockton could be scaled nationally?
And I heard it quickly, so I'll be quick. So what's next is that—
That's a general term.
What's next is that we just received a generous grant from a friend, Carol Tolan, to extend disbursements through the end of this year, precisely because of COVID-19 and of coronavirus. And before I finish answering your question, I do want to say I think that the bill that Senator Harris and Sanders and Markey are introducing is so important because COVID-19 isn't the only pandemic we will have. We live in a time of pandemics, meaning that next year will be some sort of climate disruption. We're supposed to have the worst hurricane season ever. There's going to be some sort of fire. So disruptions are now a part of our lives, right? And I think a basic income or income floor provides the stability needed to build resilience and to prepare for the next one. And as my mom always says, we have to stay ready so we don't get ready. So I'm very heartened by this conversation because, again, far too many people, particularly people of color, particularly Black people, particularly Black women, were living in an economic crisis before COVID-19. And that will be the case after, and something like an income floor will allow people to build the resilience to persist so that when the bottom falls out, there's a foundation to stand on. So in Stockton, we're doing that work, and then we're also working with other mayors who are interested in providing technical assistance and support as they try to do their other pilots. We have a resolution before the U.S. Conference of Mayors virtual conference that will happen in 2 weeks, co-sponsored by 10 other mayors, calling for sort of the bill Senator Harris advocated for, but also for the federal government to begin seriously piloting, testing, and doing basic income demonstrations in cities. Because what we're hearing from people in the streets isn't just about police brutality, it's about the violence of structural racism and the violence of poverty. And that there has to be a solution, and the guaranteed income has to be part of that 21st century social safety net.
Thank you so much, Mayor Tubbs. Felicia, the Roosevelt Institute has quite a broad vision about restructuring the economy to help working and middle class people. Can you talk about that and how you see cash support fitting in as a piece of that vision?
Thank you so much. And it's so great to be on the panel with all of you here today. So you're right, Josie, that the Roosevelt Institute does have a very broad vision because we understand the deep need for real reform of our economy, and direct cash, recurrent direct cash, is one important piece. You know, it's particularly important in this COVID economic recession, which could very well become a depression, and which we also absolutely have to recognize is racialized and is clearly one major factor in the protests that we are seeing now in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. The economic crisis and the police brutality crisis, they are intertwined. But I want to take a step back to say that the reason the Roosevelt Institute has such a big vision is because we recognize, as FDR and Eleanor did, that this is going to be a very long fight. And FDR would have said that it had 3 phases. There's a relief phase, there's a recovery phase, and ultimately there is a reform phase. And right now we are still in the relief phase, and the risk is that given the gravity of the crisis that we face, is that the risk is that we do too little rather than too much to ultimately build a stronger economy. So I think there are 4 complementary pieces. The first is cash. The second is strengthened unemployment. The third right now is state funding on the order of $500 billion, which I'll get to in just a second. And then the last is a true paycheck guarantee, which really means direct money to businesses, big and small, to make sure that they can bring their employees back on payroll. So just quickly, cash. Cash is good in situations where you have economic precarity, people on the edge, and when you have a situation of general economic sluggishness that really affects, obviously, especially lower income, middle income people. And Mayor Tubbs is absolutely right. Cash should be part of a new social contract or a new social insurance. Unemployment insurance, which I referred to, UI and cash, sorry, that's one of those acronyms. Unemployment insurance and cash together are really good bulwarks when you fall off the kind of cliff that we fell off in early March, a few months ago. So those things together are absolutely essential for people who have lost their jobs, and those things must continue until the crisis ends. The third element of relief is state funding. You know, states are going to lose up to $500 million in tax revenues because demand for services, demand for private sector, you know, GDP is going to just absolutely, it already has lessened. So because you're going to see this kind of tax revenue loss, and states are at the middle of fighting the health crisis and the unemployment crisis, states absolutely must have federal relief. It's the only way they're going to make it without huge cuts to very basic services, schools, transportation, et cetera. And then finally, that paycheck guarantee, we actually know that the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, the Payroll Protection Program, sorry, just didn't work. I could explain why, we don't have the time. But let me just say that what we need to do instead is direct payments to businesses, not mediated by banks, to make sure that people actually come back to their jobs and are able to stay connected to the workforce. That's just the relief piece. There's a lot more to say about the reform piece. I'm not going to go through the list of the things we think are necessary here, but I will close by saying that what we really need to do to get to true reform is to change the ways in which we imagine using the government to actually shape, direct, and ultimately grow the economy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Felicia. Professor Hamilton, I want to talk a little bit about the racial aspect of this. We talked about it at the beginning, and people are bringing it up, but I think your work in particular looks at what something like this means for Black and Brown families. So how would a basic income help Black and Brown families in particular in this country? And how do you see basic income impacting conversations about race, if at all?
Well, first, thank you for having me on this esteemed panel with my friends, colleagues, and learned thinkers. To answer that question, I think we have to begin with context. And the obvious context that we're in when we talk about race is literally being killed and not having free mobility in society. And then the part that is perhaps not as vivid is living with that psychological fear, if you're Black, that you are subject to being detained or bodily harmed or literally losing your life at any moment. There's also the context of COVID-19, which is the case where if we look at health disparities, I think the mortality rate is 3 times higher for Blacks than it is whites in the country. And we know that Blacks had very little resources to deal with this economic shock to begin with. When we talk about savings and cash on hand, we know that Blacks are virtually penniless. We can look at the racial wealth gap and know that that's dramatic, and that's largely driven by the little wealth that Blacks have would be through home ownership. But for the most part, Blacks are a subsistence population that relies on their job or not, or family, or some other source of income, because they don't have wealth to subsist. So even when we think of the notion of an essential worker, an essential worker, we know that certain occupations, certain races were deemed to be essential workers. So it wasn't evenly split across our economy who was essential worker and putting their life at risk in order to provide goods and services for Americans. But suppose you had a pre-existing condition and you have no savings. What it means to be an essential worker is different. You don't, or not, right? You don't have a choice as to whether you can engage in work if you have no resources to sustain yourself. So COVID-19 disproportionately hurts Black and brown people, but in reality, the dramatic hit from COVID-19 was pervasive. We made a moral decision to save people's lives by basically shutting down our economy. We didn't literally shut it down, but we shut down productive activities. So that wasn't just affecting Black and brown people, it affected all Americans. So we have a scenario of 40 million unemployed workers right now, and it's probably gonna get larger. So my point is, thinking about this whole context is relevant when we think about race. And if we think about this context, we got here with this vulnerability way before COVID-19. What has been done in an increasing inequality in America, where we have a small fraction of the society that controls most of our economic resources and are able to grasp the political infrastructure to facilitate themselves. Here is the part that's nuanced. Race and the property rights of whiteness was the trade-off. So it was vivid in President Trump's last campaign when he talked about building walls. The trade-off that was given to the masses of society to go along with a status quo was a relative position of property rights and whiteness. And I think this is vividly playing across in America. But there is hope. And the hope is, in this moment of protest, we have young white people as well that are out in the street. So hopefully there's a rejection of this immoral trade-off of one willing to go along with inequality, gross inequality, in exchange for horizontal positioning. So to me, that's the context, that white privilege is grounded in an immoral trade-off to compensate people for growing inequality. And how do we combat it? We combat it with things like basic income, an economic rights frame that would include a federal jobs guarantee, a New Deal that gives us human economic rights so that people are not captured by the use of race to pit us against each other. That is what we need. And I think we are in a position where we very well might have that. So basic income fulfills an element of a package of goods that we would need, including a federal job guarantee, so that we have economic human rights, and the immorality of using something like one's identity as a trade-off becomes less salient in our society. And I think that's the point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Professor Hamilton. I think it's so important to kind of reinforce the relationship between historical white supremacy in this country and income inequality. And I appreciate you continuing to center that in the midst of this conversation about UBI, because I don't, especially in a moment like right now, like the past week in particular, we don't want that to get lost. I really appreciate that. I want to bring it back to you, Andrew, to close. Do you see Democratic leadership, and that includes presidential nominee Joe Biden, making recurring payments as part of the Democratic platform in 2020? And if not, what do you think needs to happen to make sure that they get there?
I spoke to Joe a number of days ago, and Joe's open-minded about the fact that we are on the edge, if not already in a new depression. And one thing you know about Joe is he's not that ideological. Like, he's actually fairly pragmatic. And he will certainly get on board universal basic income if there's a groundswell of popular support and Democratic legislators and leaders are heading in that direction. So we all need to fire up as many Democratic legislators and leaders as we can to say that universal basic income is a necessity. And Joe will support that. Joe right now is open-minded about the fact that we need a new deal or a new Marshall Plan to rebuild the country. So that this is like, we have to energize the leadership. We have to get Trump out of there. And then we have to start getting to work. And I love Felicia's framing of from the Roosevelt Institute, because this is very much reminiscent of the Great Depression that FDR led us out of. And the New Deal was necessary then to maintain our way of life. There's a chance we can actually improve our way of life and address the generational inequities that have led us to this point. And I believe Joe is going to be our president, and Joe is going to sign universal basic income into law in his first term.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you. You know, this is a moment of enormous uncertainty and unprecedented, at least unprecedented in our lifetimes, economic crisis. And all of you have led the way and been transformative on this issue in a way that I don't think any of us could have imagined how quickly and urgent, how quickly it would become so urgent. So I just want to thank all of you so much for joining us. I know you're all extremely busy people, and it means so much that you joined us today. And I want to thank everybody for tuning into the briefing. Please be sure to tune in again tomorrow at 1 p.m. We're going to talk more about police violence and the killing of George Floyd with Secretary Julian Castro.